Hey, before we begin, let me say something straight from the heart. Happy birthday to you. The calendar may look like ordinary squares and numbers, but today is different. Today is a small constellation, and at its quiet center is your name. Candles are only fire until they are asked to mean something. Breath is only air until it moves with intention. So take this minute, take this day, and feel it turn like a key in a lock, opening a door you didn't know you were ready to walk through. You have come this far through storms you rarely mentioned, and through quiet rooms where nobody applauded, but you kept going anyway. That matters. The world is full of noise. Today is for signal, wherever you are. A crowded kitchen where laughter is the wallpaper. A quiet apartment with one cake slice and a brave smile. A workplace that smells of coffee and tomorrow. Know that this moment is yours. You are allowed to celebrate the simple fact that you arrived, you endured, you learned. You are allowed to dream a size larger and walk toward it with the soft, stubborn confidence of someone who has decided to be the author of their next chapter. You may not realize it, but some of the greatest legends who ever lived were also born on this same date. That's not a coincidence. It's a quiet invitation. Their journeys sketch out a constellation of possibility that includes you, your ideas, your work, your resilient hope. As we travel through their stories, let them be more than biographies. Let them be bridges. Let them be the reminder that excellence is not a lightning strike, but a series of deliberate steps taken when no one is clapping. They were ordinary until persistence made them otherwise. You share a birthday with brilliance, and that is not a burden, but a map. When this episode ends and the candles are smoke and memory, carry one lesson forward. Begin where you are. Use what you have, and move with the courage to become your own kind of legend. Legend 1. She began in a Midwestern childhood, where ambition wore sensible shoes, and courage sounded like a question asked one more time. From suburban streets, she rose not by accident, but by appetite, for learning, for service, for the stubborn work of making institutions kinder than she found them. At Wellesley, a young Hillary Rodham stood at a podium and spoke with a voice that carried farther than she knew. At Yale, Hillary Rodham Clinton became a lawyer who chased the shape of fairness and found it incomplete. She married companionship to purpose and entered public life with sleeves rolled and eyes open, working with children and families long before the camera discovered her name. To those who thought politics was only slogans and strategy, she carried binders, footnotes, and the patience of a careful mind. Washington, Albany, international capitals, she learned each room the way a violinist learns a hall, listening for the faintest echo that could distort the music. The turning point was never single, never cinematic. It was a long braid of moments, a healthcare reform that taught resilience, a world stage in Beijing where the sentence, "Women's rights are human rights," rang like a bell, a season of service that turned into a duty, then into an office, then into a mandate, written by millions of ballots. She faced a country that loved her, feared her, needed her, questioned her, and she walked straight through the noise. She lost and returned. She was counted out and counted herself back in. In the middle of storms, she learned the weather patterns of power, the pressure systems of compromise, the sudden downpours of criticism, the rare clear days when progress is visible from a long distance. As senator, as Secretary of State, as a candidate who carried more votes than any woman in her nation's history. She wrote chapters that scholars will underline and argue over, but whose subtext is simple. Preparation is a kind of bravery that leaves a long shadow. There's a way to measure a life like hers against the world's ledger. Place it beside the great statespeople of our era, those who stitched alliances together, thread by patient thread, those who understood that diplomacy is the art of keeping the future possible, and the work holds. Compare her with the pioneers who took the first steps so others could run, those who shattered ceilings not for the sake of the shatter, but for the light it lets in, and the glass is still falling in her wake. Across continents, she became a shorthand for tenacity, for the proposition that policy can be compassionate without becoming naive. Where others chased applause, she chased outcomes, healthcare for children, relief for first responders, a modernized statecraft that treated cyberspace and climate as necessities, not decorations. Measured against global peers, she stands where persistence stands, near the center of any honest conversation about what it takes to move a nation a few inches closer to its stated ideals. Her impact lasts because it was always larger than one election, one office, one news cycle. It is the steady proof that work behind the microphone matters, that homework can be a kind of heroism. She modeled a leadership that refuses to confuse loud with strong, that chooses detail over stunt, and that counts success in the lives made a little safer, a little kinder. The moral of her arc is stitched in blue thread. Progress is a stubborn verb. Carry it with you. If the world tells you to wait your turn, ask what they're building while they wait, then build it anyway. She understood that the best victories are often invisible. The Children's Health Insurance Program did not carry her name, but it carried her fingerprints, the kind of policy win that introduces itself at kitchen tables rather than on televised stages. As America's face abroad, she treated travel not as a tally, but as a translation project, turning the language of ideals into partnerships, turning the vocabulary of security to include education for girls, the safety of activists, the fragile architectures of digital freedom. And when history placed her on the ballot, she stood in a long, thin line of women across the Atlantic world who were told power was presumptuous until they used it, a line that includes the iron-willed and the quietly relentless alike. Compared globally, her record reveals something rarer than charisma, stamina, in service of the common good. She showed that you can be pragmatic without surrendering principle, that compromise can be an instrument of progress rather than its grave. Her presence in the public square widened the square. Girls in classrooms from Iowa to India traced possibilities they hadn't been invited to imagine. Even those who opposed her often did so on ground she had flattened and paved, the terrain of serious policy argument. That is the mark of a legend. It is not unanimity of praise, but durability of influence. In a world that rewards the instant and the incendiary, she remained committed to the long term, to the slow-turning gears that really shift history. Her lesson to you today is resolute and practical. Take your competence personally. Let excellence be your protest. When your dream meets resistance, let your preparation be the fact that changes the room. Legend 2. In a year when music was being born in many countries at once, a child arrived in Naples to a house where melody was not a visitor, but a resident. Domenico Scarlatti grew up with counterpoint in his pocket, with the prickle of invention in his fingers, and with a father whose shadow was itself a symphony. But he did what the restless always do. He left. In Lisbon, he found a court, hungry for brilliance, a princess whose practice keys were lanterns in the evening. Then Madrid, where the air tasted of dust and dance, where guitars argued with castanets, and the street knew more about rhythm than the academy. He listened. He borrowed. He learned to let the harpsichord speak in accents the instrument had never quite admitted before. The turning point was not fame, but freedom. Freed from his father's command and the expected opera house career, he turned to the small form that could hold a private storm. In royal rooms he taught, and in quiet nights he invented. Those 555 sonatas are not a ledger of repetition. They are variations on restlessness. They sound like Spain without cliché, like Portugal without pretense, like Naples remembered by someone who left and kept loving it anyway. He wrote with the courage of disobedience, crossing hands like swallows in flight, asking fingers to leap wider than polite society preferred, driving repeated notes like hoofbeats down the keyboard until you could taste dust and sunlight in the same bar. He smuggled the street into the salon, the marketplace into the music school, and found that audiences would follow if you were honest about the dance in your bones. Measure his work against the great keyboard architects, the contrapuntal cathedrals of Bach, the lyric clarity of Rameau, and you find a different genius, not lesser, but lateral. Where others built vaults of reason, he opened windows. Where others fixed the stars in a perfect system, he taught them to shimmer. Around the globe, pianists returned to his pages the way travelers return to a beloved city, to get lost again, to find a new street. He anticipated the virtuoso's age without surrendering to mere display, proving that athleticism at the keyboard could be a servant of expression rather than its master. Line up his sonatas beside the world's great keyboard literature, and they do not bow. They bow you in. What remains is a map of how innovation works, how it hides in the small forms, how it folds the exotic into the everyday until they cannot be told apart. He taught that imitation is a beginning, not an ending, that a nation's folkways can become a schoolmaster if you are humble enough to listen. The lesson is this: if the path expected of you leads to grand halls and ovations, it is still brave to take a side street and find a revolution in a single room where your hands can fly. Let his sonatas remind you that borders, between genres, between nations, between tradition and experiment, are often nothing more than lines drawn in pencil. Listen closely, and you hear craft hiding in the fireworks. The binary architecture of his sonatas, two halves in dialogue, each returning home changed, was a disciplined frame that made mischief musical. He tilted accents until the rhythm hiccuped like a dancer catching breath. He wrote guitar strums into keyboard figuration so that wood and wire seemed to trade places. Editors later gave his pieces numbers and catalogs, but musicians gave them lives. From harpsichordists who relish the sting of plucked strings, to pianists who coax thunder and silk out of modern hammers, the world keeps finding new fingerprints inside his pages. You can line him up next to the monumental minds, the architects of fugue and form, and he will smile. Then sprint a scale that sounds like hooves on cobblestone. That is his quiet boast. That joy can be serious art. Compared to global innovators, his gift was portability. Spanish street rhythms, Portuguese tenderness, Italian rigor. He wore each like a second skin, and then stitched them together. That cosmopolitan ear made him an ancestor of the modern mashup, long before the word existed. And if some critics once treated his sonatas as etudes, the performers proved them wrong in new centuries, placing them in recital halls, where their sparkle could refract against Bach's gravitas and Mozart's grace, and hold its own light. Legend 3. She came to Africa as a child, trailing the last wisps of an English autumn behind her. Kenya adopted her with sun and dust, with horses that needed whispering more than reins. Before engines, there were hooves. Before airfields, there were stables. Before crowds, the private courage of a young trainer who learned that patience is stronger than luck. Beryl Markham would become the first woman in her country to earn a trainer's license, a quiet rebellion signed in sweat and saddle soap. But it was the sky that finally called her by name, and she answered with an aircraft and an appetite for horizons. The turning point had the smell of gasoline and salt air. She set out to cross the Atlantic the hard way, east to west, against the winds that bully even the confident. Alone, through night and weather and the deep geography of doubt, she navigated by instrument and instinct until land rose beneath her like a promise she had paid for in courage. The landing was rough, the machine unwilling, but the record did not consult the runway. It consulted the attempt. Newspapers took her name and made it a headline, but the truer story was quieter. A woman who had learned to listen to animals and engines with the same disciplined empathy, and who believed that limits were often just the first draft of a route map. She wrote a book, The Way Some People Build a House, sturdy, lyrical, meant to be lived in for a while. West with the night carried the high, clean air of her flights and the red soil of her childhood. The sentences were long enough to hold weather, precise enough to smell of rain. Other writers read her and admired the quiet blade of her prose. Place her among the celebrated aviators and explorers, from Earhart to Saint-Exupéry, and her story does more than belong. It expands the category. Place her among the great memoirists of a continent in change, and her pages hold. Around the world, students of courage study her itinerary. Learn something deeply, love it honestly, then let it teach you how to do the next impossible thing. What remains is a woman who refused to sort her life into boxes. She was both hooves and propellers, both solitude and society, both landmark and literature. When the world tried to file her under one heading, she kept adding chapters. The lesson is written in visible ink. Take your craft seriously enough to cross oceans for it. And when someone tries to tell you what you are, only a trainer, only a pilot, only a writer, smile at them from your cockpit window and keep climbing. The clouds do not care about categories. They care that you keep your wings level and your heart brave. There were other flights, other routes. She mapped East Africa from a cockpit, carried mail and medicines across distances that could eat a day for breakfast, and learned to land where runways were nothing more than firm convictions. She failed sometimes. Every pioneer does. And then she recalibrated the instruments and tried again. Her life gathered rumors the way open skies gather weather, but the reliable barometer was always the work. Measured against the world's aviators, she brought a trainer's patience to the clouds and a writer's precision to memory. She did not ask to be compared. She asked to be measured by the miles and the sentences. In that accounting, she stands taller than many statues. Across continents, her story has become a quiet dare to anyone who has felt misfiled by expectation. If you are an artist who loves engines, a scientist who paints, an athlete who writes poetry, her example frees you from the tyranny of choosing only one. The skies allowed her to be plural. That is perhaps the bravest claim of all. Legend 4. He was born into a century that believed breakfast could save a soul. In a Midwest of factories and farmhands, he listened to the sermons of health and the whispers of markets, and realized they might be singing the same tune. He failed first, because the ambitious often do, and illness showed him the arithmetic of limits. In recovery, he found an idea at the intersection of appetite and optimism. A hot drink that suggested the morning could be gentle. A crisp cereal that suggested industriousness could also be kind to the stomach. C.W. Post looked at grain and saw not just food, but a story people would want to live inside. The turning point was a decision to market with the zeal of a revival. Coupons like tiny promises, slogans like handshakes, mailers that arrived with the charm of a neighbor on the porch. He named things as if he were naming futures, grains that sounded more like virtues than ingredients, and he built factories that were also arguments for prosperity. A model town rose on the plains, a place with clean lines and careful rules where he tried to organize not just work, but life. The business pages took note, but more importantly, kitchen tables did. Families poured his inventions into bowls and into mornings, until routine itself felt upgraded. Hold his work up against the great industrial storytellers, those who wrapped products in myth until the label felt like a friend, and he stands among them. Across oceans, his methods taught companies how to talk to people as if they were people, not markets. In grocery aisles from America to beyond, his legacy is the modern language of brands, a kind of folk poetry stuck to cardboard. And yes, the claims were sometimes grander than the science, because the era was, yet the underlying revolution was real. He understood that value is partly nutrition and partly narrative. Compare his influence to entrepreneurs who built empires on sugar water, on shoes, on screens. His genius belongs beside theirs, a reminder that the story you tell about a product can feed a nation's imagination as surely as the product feeds its body. His impact is in cupboards and in culture. He helped invent the idea that a company could be a character in the national story, that a meal could be merchandised into a feeling, and that the assembly line could feed not only bodies, but identities. The lesson is not to worship commerce, but to understand its pen. Every advertisement is a paragraph in how we imagine ourselves. Write yours with care. If you build something, speak of it honestly, dress it in hope, and let your customer become your co-author. A good breakfast cannot solve every problem, but it can begin a day that solves one. Say the names out loud, and you can taste an era. Postum, a gentle grain drink for nervous systems. Grape nuts, crunch that promised stamina. Cornflakes rebranded into Post Toasties so that breakfast could sound like a sunrise. He tried 1,000 small gambits, premiums tucked into packages, coupons that felt like applause, recipes that invited a brand into Sunday supper. Even his model community had a name that sounded like a thesis. Post City, a place later known simply as Post, Texas, a monument in brick and street grid to the idea that prosperity could be designed. Not every venture succeeded, and not every claim aged well, but the experiment mattered. Compared globally with industrial pioneers in Europe's chocolate towns and Asia's shipyards, he belongs to that restless cohort who believed a factory could manufacture not only goods, but futures. They were right and wrong in equal measure. The truth is complicated. He built, he boasted, he sometimes overreached. And still, he left America with a signature morning. His legacy invites nuance, to celebrate ingenuity while interrogating rhetoric, to enjoy convenience while guarding against credulity. For you, the lesson is craft plus conscience. Make the thing and make the story, but let both withstand daylight. Legend 5. He grew up where straight edge meant a promise kept in a loud room, where discipline could be punk and rebellion could be radical honesty. The Ring was a square of pure theater, where pain was rehearsed, yet somehow still real, and he discovered that truth can wear boots and still run. The early years were small stages, long drives, the kind of hunger that counts gas money in coins. He found a family on the road, wrestlers and fans entwined in a shared conspiracy to believe. But what set him apart wasn't only athleticism. It was a voice sharpened on the whetstone of conviction. Phil Brooks, CM Punk, decided that the microphone could be an instrument of truth as much as hype, and the world listened. The turning point was a monologue that didn't ask permission. In a sport that builds heroes in factories, he stepped out with edges still sharp and told the audience what he loved, what he hated, what he intended to change. The lines between character and person blurred. The crowd recognized itself. Championships came, and with them the burden of proving that a rebel can run the place without becoming what he rebelled against. He walked away, when walking away was unprofitable. He tried his hand in other arenas, where the bruises counted differently, and then he returned on his own terms, proving that chapters can be rewritten if the author is stubborn enough. He won not only with knees and kicks, but with sentences, turning the promo into a modern soliloquy that could move product and people at the same time. Compare his work across the globe, to the icons who made the squared circle feel like a cathedral, to the talkers who bent reality until audience and actor were collaborators. And he belongs comfortably in that upper shelf where influence lives. Kids on 5 continents now cut promos in mirrors, trying to find the cadence of conviction he taught them. In an age when entertainment risks becoming algorithm, he remained insistently human, insisting that story comes first, that sweat must be honest, even if the outcomes are scripted. Measured beside legendary showmen in Japan, Mexico, North America, and beyond, he holds his own because authenticity travels without a passport. The lesson he leaves is that integrity is not a prop. It is the plot. His impact lasts because it is stitched into fan memory and into the business model of a whole industry. He proved that authenticity can sell out arenas, that ethics can be a brand, and that a human being can be a thesis statement shouted over 20,000 hearts. If you can pair principle with performance, you'll be hard to beat, even when the script says you shouldn't win. Keep your promises loudly. Keep your boundaries kindly. Keep your voice unborrowed, because imitation is cheap until the crowd decides who is real. Before arenas learned his cadence, church basements and gymnasiums did. He wrestled nights that ended with ice packs and small paydays, stitched a following out of word of mouth, and learned that belief is a muscle you must exercise. In the big leagues, his championship reign stretched long enough to become a case study in how to keep a crowd leaning forward week after week. The famous tirade at a microphone, equal parts confession and manifesto, rattled an industry into remembering that surprise is oxygen. And when he stepped away, critics wrote endings. When he returned, the roof moved. Measured against Japan's technicians, Mexico's high flyers, Europe's brutal stylists, he carved a lane built on argument and authenticity. Other performers can imitate moves. Fewer can counterfeit conviction. That is why his name is shouted with the sort of rhythm usually reserved for hymns and protests. His example isn't about fame, it's about standards. Keep your code even when contracts blur the edges. Say no when your yes would be louder, but less true. For anyone building a career in public, he offers a blueprint. Speak clearly, work fiercely, care, actually. And so we return to you, the person this day is really about. The legends of your birthday do not ask you to imitate them. Imitation is a poor cousin of courage. They ask you to notice what they noticed, that beginnings are messy, that turning points often look like detours, and that greatness is sometimes just the patience to turn small daily work into an empire of meaning. Today, as the light leans across your floor, choose one step that scares you in the right direction. Put your hands on the instrument of your craft, your keyboard, your toolkit, your camera, your courage, and practice until the room begins to echo. Then share it. The world needs your specific sound. If this story touched you, subscribe so we can meet again, and leave a comment with your birthday so we can celebrate you next. Your year begins now. Walk into it with a brave, steady heart. Wherever you are listening, from a bus commute to a quiet walk after dinner, know that your life is allowed to glow gradually. You don't have to explode to be extraordinary. Leave us a note with the day you were born, so we can make you an episode of your own and bring a friend along next time. Subscribe so this circle of stories can include you again, because the world is better when we keep reminding one another to build, to begin, to become.